Welcome to Health Simplified. Today, we're going to be diving into sugar,
Yeah.
but not just any sugar.
Right.
Glucose versus fructose.
Yes.
Which one is the real villain when it comes to our health?
Mm,
You sent over some fascinating research on this.
I did.
And I have to admit, I learned a lot getting ready for this deep dive.
Good.
So, for those who might not be sugar experts, can you give us a quick reminder of what glucose and fructose actually are?
Absolutely. So both glucose and fructose are simple sugars. They're the most basic units of carbohydrates.
Okay.
But think of them like fraternal twins.
Okay.
They share some similarities, but have distinct personalities and definitely go down different paths in the body.
I love that analogy. So
Yeah.
tell me more about these different personalities. What's glucose's deal?
Glucose is like the body's go-to energy source.
Okay.
It's what our cells crave,
Yeah.
what fuels our muscles and brain.
Okay.
When we eat glucose, it's absorbed into the bloodstream, and that triggers the release of insulin. Insulin is like a key that unlocks the doors of our cells, letting glucose in to be used for energy.
So glucose is kind of like the efficient worker bee of the sugar world.
Yeah.
Gets the job done
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
What about fructose?
Fructose is a bit more of a complex character.
Okay.
You'll often hear it called fruit sugar because it's found naturally in fruits.
Right?
But here's where things get tricky.
Okay.
The fructose we get from a juicy apple is very different from the fructose we get from a can of soda, even though chemically it's the same molecule.
You know, I've always wondered about that. How can fructose in fruit be okay when we hear so much about how bad fructose is for us?
It's all about context. In fruit, fructose is hanging out with fiber, vitamins, antioxidants, a whole entourage of nutrients that help moderate how it's absorbed and processed in the body.
Okay.
Plus, the amount of fructose in a serving of fruit is way lower than what you'd get in a processed food.
So it's like fructose has a built-in buffer system.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's get back to that other kind of fructose, the one that's not part of a balanced breakfast.
Right.
What happens when we overload on that?
Well, this is where those metabolic differences we talked about really come into play.
Okay.
Glucose, as we discussed, is used by cells throughout the body for energy,
Mm-hmm.
but fructose is primarily handled by the liver.
Okay.
It's like fructose has one very specific job, and if you overwhelm its department, things can go haywire.
Okay, so fructose is the specialist, but maybe not one you want working overtime.
Right.
What kind of haywire are we talking about here?
One of the biggest concerns is that the liver can start turning excess fructose into fat, specifically triglycerides.
Okay.
High triglyceride levels in the blood are linked to heart disease and other health problems.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, too much fructose can also contribute to fatty liver disease,
Okay.
which is essentially when the liver starts accumulating too much fat and can't function as efficiently.
That sounds pretty serious.
Yep.
And some of the research you sent mentioned that fructose can even impact how our bodies store fat, right?
Absolutely. You know how we often talk about subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch, and visceral fat, the kind that surrounds your organs?
Right.
Well, studies have shown that high fructose diets can lead to an increase in visceral fat, even if you don't gain weight overall.
Wow.
And that's a big deal because visceral fat is linked to a higher risk of heart disease,
Okay.
type 2 diabetes, and other chronic conditions.
Wow. That's a real game changer.
Yeah.
It means that even if the number on the scale isn't budging, what you're eating could still be affecting your health in a major way.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about calories in, calories out. It's about what those calories are made of.
Precisely. And this is where understanding the different ways our bodies handle glucose and fructose becomes so important.
Okay.
It's not about demonizing fructose entirely,
Okay.
but about being aware of its potential downsides,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's consumed in excess and in those processed forms.
So basically, fructose can be a bit of a troublemaker,
Yeah.
especially in large doses.
Yeah.
But even glucose, despite being our body's preferred energy source, isn't completely off the hook, right?
That's right. At the end of the day, any type of sugar consumed in excess, meaning you're taking in more calories than you're burning, can contribute to weight gain and potential metabolic issues.
Right.
It's all about balance and moderation.
So no matter what kind of sugar we're talking about, portion control is key.
Exactly. And this is where things can get a little tricky for people because it's not always easy to tell how much sugar you're actually consuming,
Right.
especially when you consider all the different names for added sugars that hide out on ingredient lists.
Oh, absolutely. It's like sugar is playing a game of hide and seek with our health.
Yeah.
There's high fructose corn syrup, sucrose, dextrose, maltose, agave nectar. The list goes on.
You got it. And if you're not carefully reading labels, It's easy to consume way more sugar than you realize.
That's a great point. So before we jump into some of the specific research findings you sent, maybe we can quickly recap the key differences between how our bodies handle glucose and fructose,
Sure.
just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Think of it this way. Glucose is like a versatile all-rounder
Okay.
used by cells throughout the body.
Okay.
Fructose is more of a specialist, processed primarily by the liver.
Okay.
Both can be problematic in excess, but fructose seems to have a greater potential for causing certain metabolic issues,
Right.
especially when it comes from added sugars and processed foods.
Okay. That's a great summary.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of those research studies you mentioned. I'm really curious to hear more about what scientists have uncovered about the effects of fructose on our health.
All right, let's do it. One study I found particularly compelling looked at how even moderate amounts of fructose can impact our metabolism.
Oh, wow.
It turns out that even a small amount of fructose can start to affect the way our body processes sugar.
Really? Even small amount. I think a lot of people assume that as long as they're not guzzling soda all day, they're in the clear.
That's a common misconception.
Oh.
This particular study found that moderate fructose intake actually impaired insulin sensitivity in healthy young men.
Oh, wow.
And remember, insulin sensitivity is how well our cells respond to insulin and take up glucose from the bloodstream.
Okay, wait. Can we back up for a second?
Sure.
I know we touched on insulin earlier,
Yeah.
but for those who might need a refresher, can you quickly remind us what insulin resistance is
Yeah,
and why it's such a big deal?
you bet. Think of insulin like a key that unlocks your cells to let glucose in.
Okay.
When you eat a lot of sugar, it's like using that key too much.
Mhm.
It starts to wear down, and eventually it might not work as well.
Okay.
That's insulin resistance.
Okay.
Your body has to pump out more and more insulin to get the same effect.
Okay.
And over time, this can lead to chronically elevated blood sugar levels
Right.
and potentially type 2 diabetes.
So even moderate amounts of fructose can start to mess with that delicate system.
Exactly. It's like a slippery slope. And another study found that even a low dose of high fructose corn syrup, just 10% of daily energy intake, was enough to increase late evening triglyceride levels, even without weight gain.
Wow.
So even if you're not seeing it on the scale, it could be impacting your blood work.
That's a little scary to think about.
Yeah.
It really highlights how even seemingly small amounts of added fructose can have an impact.
Right.
And high fructose corn syrup is in so many processed foods, it's hard
Yeah.
to avoid completely.
It really is ubiquitous.
It is.
And this is why it's so important to be mindful of what you're eating
Right.
and to really scrutinize those food labels.
Okay.
Even if a product claims to be low fat or sugar-free, it could still be loaded with hidden sources of fructose.
That's a great reminder. It's easy to get fooled by those health halos.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the impact of fructose on triglycerides and insulin sensitivity. What else should we be aware of?
Well, why did the sources you sent mention a connection between fructose intake and uric acid levels?
Ah, yes. I remember reading about that.
Yeah.
Can you explain what uric acid is and why this connection matters?
Sure. Uric acid is a waste product that's produced when our bodies break down certain substances called purines.
Right.
Normally, it's filtered out by our kidneys and excreted in urine.
Yeah.
But when uric acid levels get too high, it can form crystals that deposit in joints, causing gout,
Yeah.
a painful inflammatory condition.
Right.
And high fructose intake has been linked to an increased risk of gout in men and an increased risk of kidney stones in general.
That's definitely something to keep in mind, especially if you have a family history of gout or kidney stones.
Yeah.
It seems like fructose has its fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak, when it comes to our health.
It really does. And this is why it's so important to have a balanced view of fructose.
Right.
It's not inherently evil, but it's something to be mindful of, especially in our modern food environment where added sugars are so prevalent.
So how do we navigate this complex sugar landscape and make healthier choices? What practical advice could you give our listeners based on all this research?
Well, first and foremost, I would say focus on whole foods.
Okay.
Choose whole fruits over fruit juices, opt for water or unsweetened beverages instead of sugary drinks, and cook more meals at home so you can control the ingredients.
Right.
And when you do consume processed foods, become a label-reading ninja.
Yeah, love that. Label reading ninjas.
Yeah.
What should we be looking out for specifically?
First, check the total grams of sugar per serving.
Okay.
Then, scan that ingredient list for any of those sneaky aliases for added sugar.
Right.
Remember, if sugar is listed near the beginning, that means it's a major component of the product.
Right.
And don't be afraid to compare brands and choose options with lower sugar content.
Those are great tips. It
Yeah.
sounds like knowledge is really power when it comes to making informed choices about sugar.
Absolutely. The more you know, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the food landscape and make choices that support your health.
So we've got our label reading ninja skills sharpened,
Yeah.
and we're ready to tackle those grocery aisles. But what about those times when we just crave something sweet? Is there any wiggle room here?
Of course, deprivation isn't the answer.
Right.
It's all about balance and finding ways to satisfy your sweet tooth in a way that doesn't sabotage your health goals.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that sugar isn't inherently bad.
Okay.
It's about being mindful of the types and amounts of sugar you're consuming and making sure it's not crowding out those nutrient-rich foods that should form the foundation of your diet.
That makes sense. So it's not necessarily about cutting out sugar entirely, but about making sure it's not the main event.
Exactly. Think of it this way. If you're eating a balanced diet full of fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains, you're already getting some natural sugars from those foods.
Okay.
That leaves a little room for those occasional sweet treats without going overboard.
Okay, I like that approach. So instead of feeling guilty about every little indulgence, it's about creating a healthy balance that allows for those moments of enjoyment.
Right. And it's also about being mindful of portion sizes and frequency.
Right.
Instead of having dessert every night, maybe save it for special occasions or weekends.
Right.
And when you do indulge, savor every bite. Really pay attention to the flavors and textures and make it an experience rather than just a mindless habit.
That's a great tip. It's so easy to mindlessly munch on sweets without even really tasting them.
Yeah.
But when you slow down and savor each bite, you can actually enjoy it more and feel
Yeah.
more satisfied.
Exactly. It's about being present and mindful of what you're eating.
Right.
And don't underestimate the power of those naturally sweet foods like fruits. They can really help satisfy that craving for sweetness without the added sugars.
Oh, absolutely. Berries, melons, apples are all so delicious and packed with nutrients. They're like nature's candy.
And don't forget about spices like cinnamon or nutmeg.
Oh, yeah.
They can add a touch of sweetness to your meals and beverages without the added sugar.
Those are great ideas. So it sounds like we've got a two-pronged approach here. Reducing our intake of added sugars while simultaneously increasing our intake of naturally sweet, nutrient-rich foods.
You got it. And remember, these changes don't have to happen overnight.
Right.
Start with small, sustainable adjustments to your diet.
Yuck.
Maybe swap out that sugary soda for a glass of water with lemon, or replace that processed dessert with a piece of fruit.
I love that approach.
Yeah,
It's about progress, not perfection.
exactly.
And those small changes can really add up over time. You know, as we've been talking about all this research, I keep thinking about how much information is out there about sugar.
Uh-huh.
It can be overwhelming and confusing, even for someone like me who loves to geek out on health topics.
I completely agree. It seems like every day there's a new study or a new headline about sugar.
Yeah.
It's enough to make anyone's head spin.
So how can our listeners cut through the noise and make sure they're getting accurate, evidence-based information about sugar?
That's such an important question. I would say the key is to look for sources that are credible and unbiased.
Okay.
Stick with reputable health organizations like the American Heart Association or the American Diabetes Association.
Oh.
And always be wary of sensationalized headlines or claims that sound too good to be true. If something sounds too extreme or too restrictive, it probably is.
That's great advice. It's about being a critical consumer of information, just like we need to be critical consumers of food.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Right.
If you're unsure about a particular ingredient or the sugar content of a product,
Yeah.
reach out to the manufacturer or consult a registered dietitian for guidance.
I think that's such an important point. There's no shame in seeking expert help, especially when it comes to something as complex as nutrition.
Absolutely. Registered dietitians are trained to provide evidence-based guidance and help you make sense of all the conflicting information out there.
Right.
They can help you create a personalized eating plan that meets your individual needs and goals.
That's so reassuring to hear. Sometimes it feels like we're expected to be nutrition experts.
Right.
But it's okay to admit that we need help sometimes.
Exactly. We're all learning and growing, and there's always more to discover when it comes to health and nutrition.
Right.
And remember, knowledge is power.
Yes.
The more informed you are, the better equipped you'll be to make healthy choices that support your overall well-being.
I love that. So let's empower our listeners with a few key takeaways based on all the research we've discussed today.
Okay.
What are the most important things people should remember about glucose versus fructose and the impact of sugar on our health?
Okay. Here are a few key points to keep in mind. First, Both glucose and fructose are simple sugars, but they're metabolized differently in the body.
Okay.
Glucose is the body's preferred energy source, while fructose is primarily processed by the liver.
Right.
Second, excessive intake of any type of sugar can lead to health problems, but fructose seems to have a greater potential for causing certain metabolic issues,
Right.
especially when it comes from added sugars and processed foods.
Yep.
Third, high fructose diets can lead to an increase in visceral fat even without overall weight gain.
Right.
And visceral fat is that dangerous kind of fat that surrounds your organs and is linked to a higher risk of chronic diseases.
Right.
Fourth, even moderate amounts of fructose can impair insulin sensitivity,
Right.
which is a key factor in developing type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
And finally, it's important to be aware of the many hidden names for added sugars on food labels
Right.
and to make a conscious effort to reduce your intake of these sneaky sugars.
Okay, those are great takeaways. And I think it's important to reiterate that fructose isn't inherently evil.
Right.
It's all about context and moderation.
Exactly. When we consume fructose as part of a whole food like a piece of fruit, we're also getting those beneficial nutrients that help mitigate any potential negative effects.
Right.
The problem lies in the concentrated doses of fructose we get from processed foods and beverages, where it's often stripped of its natural companions and consumed in excessive quantities.
So don't ditch the fruit basket. It's still a valuable part of a healthy diet,
Absolutely.
but maybe go easy on the soda and candy.
Precisely. And remember, it's all about finding that sweet spot where you can enjoy the pleasures of food while also prioritizing your health.
I love that. It's about balance, moderation, and savoring those sweet moments in life.
Yeah.
And it's about remembering that food is more than just fuel. It's about nourishment, pleasure, and connection.
Beautifully said. And it's about recognizing that each of us has a unique relationship with food, and what works for one person might not work for another.
So true. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to nutrition.
Precisely. It's about finding what works best for you, your body, and your lifestyle.
Now, before we sign off, I want to circle back to one of the studies we discussed earlier.
Okay?
The one that showed how high fructose diets can lead to an increase in visceral fat, even without overall weight gain. That really struck a chord with me, and I'm sure it did with many of our listeners as well. It really is a bit of an eye-opener. I think for a lot of people, the number on the scale is the primary measure of their health.
Yeah.
But this study shows that what's going on inside our bodies can be a totally different story.
It really challenges that calories in, calories out mentality.
Right.
We've been conditioned to think that as long as our weight is stable, we're good.
Right.
But the research on fructose suggests that the types of calories we consume can have a significant impact on our metabolic health, even if our weight doesn't fluctuate.
So it's not just about how much we're eating.
Right.
It's about what we're eating.
Exactly.
And those choices can have a ripple effect throughout our bodies.
Precisely. And it underscores the importance of looking beyond the scale and paying attention to other markers of health,
Okay.
such as blood sugar levels, cholesterol levels, and blood pressure.
It's about taking a holistic view of health rather than getting fixated on one single metric.
Exactly. It's about understanding that our bodies are complex systems and everything is interconnected.
So how can we apply this knowledge to our everyday lives? What are some tangible steps our listeners can take to make healthier choices about sugar, knowing what we now know about the unique effects of fructose?
Well, I think a good place to start is by simply becoming more aware of how much added sugar you're consuming.
Okay.
Take a look at your typical daily diet and see where those hidden sugars might be lurking.
Okay.
Are you drinking sugary beverages regularly? Are you snacking on processed foods that are high in added sugars?
Okay.
Once you have a better sense of your current intake, you can start making gradual changes.
So it's not about going cold turkey on sugar overnight.
Right.
It's about making those small, sustainable adjustments that can have a big impact over time.
Exactly. For example, if you're used to drinking soda every day, maybe start by swapping one soda for a glass of water or unsweetened tea each day. And if you find yourself reaching for a sugary snack in the afternoon, try having a piece of fruit or a handful of nuts instead.
Right.
These small changes might seem insignificant at first, but they can really add up over time.
And those swaps not only reduce your added sugar intake, but also increase your intake of nutrient-rich whole foods.
Yes.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. And remember, it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about progress. not perfection.
Yes.
Don't beat yourself up if you have an occasional indulgence.
Right.
The key is to make those healthier choices most of the time and to enjoy those sweet treats in moderation.
And to really savor those treats when you do indulge.
Yes.
Make it an experience rather than a mindless habit.
Exactly. And don't forget about the power of mindful eating.
Right.
When you slow down, pay attention to your food, and really taste each bite, you're more likely to feel satisfied and less likely to overeat. This can be especially helpful when it comes to sugary foods.
That's a great point. Mindfulness can really help us tune in to our body's cues and make more intentional choices about what we're eating.
And remember, knowledge is power.
Yes.
The more you learn about how different foods affect your body, the better equipped you'll be to make choices that support your health and well-being.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive into the world of sugar.
It was my pleasure.
I hope our listeners found this conversation informative, insightful, and empowering.
Me too.
Thank you for taking the time out to listen to our deep dive. Until next time, stay healthy and stay informed.